Black Rat began to point to one side, and while he was touching his head with his hand, he turned his head towards Lu Fan and with a confused look decided to accept and guide them towards the portal. He started to push aside the plants with his hands, and with a calm look informed them that they had already arrived at the entrance of Feilong Cemetery. Lu Fan and Giant Ying started to look up, and upon seeing what had appeared in front of them, they couldn't help but be left open-mouthed and on alert at the same time. In front of them was a giant tree with wooden stairs. Lu Fan couldn't help but be surprised to see that the portal of the Divine Wood Dragon was here. A giant red portal appeared. Little by little they began to walk towards the portal. But just then, Black Rat turned his back on them, put one hand into his pants pocket, started waving goodbye with the other, closed his eyes, and said farewell to them since his task was already completed. They would see each other again if they had the chance. Lu Fan turned around, began to extend his hand towards him and with a calm look asked him to wait a moment. He extended his hand towards him, started to look into his eyes and began to smile. Now that they were destined, he decided to become friends with him. The secret hunters had visited many places, so it was possible that he needed to ask for help to find out some locations. Black Rat started pointing at himself with his finger, and while a drop of sweat was falling from his cheek, with a confused look he asked Lu Fan which locations he was talking about. Giant Ying started to approach the portal. While Lu Fan had one hand resting on his waist, he extended the other towards him, and with a pleasant smile explained that in exchange for locations he would receive a reward. Upon hearing this, Black Rat couldn't help but be dumbfounded. He didn't know if Lu Fan wanted to buy information about locations. He also added that he could not reveal information about secret realms, but he could do so about geographical locations. Lu Fan started to look at him, extended his hand to one side, and with a calm look explained that the Association of Secret Hunters did not agree with the private exchange of information about the secret realms, but only the location did not count as a violation. Black Rat put his hand under his chin, closed his eyes and began to think. Several seconds later, he opened his eyes, began to extend his hand towards him, and with an indecisive look told him that he could reveal a location in exchange for 100,000 dragon coins. According to him, this was a friendly price. Lu Fan shook his hand, and with a smile told him that now they had made a deal. Black Rat, who was shaking his hand, couldn't help but feel somewhat confused and think that he had gotten into trouble. He didn't know if the people from Longdu Academy were so rich. Some time later, Lu Fan crossed the portal and appeared in the secret realm. He set foot on the other side, and with a serious look began to observe the surroundings. According to the system window, this secret realm was called Flying Dragon Cemetery. It was level 55, had a nightmare difficulty, and the limit of people was more than 2. Giant Ying, who had entered before Lu Fan, crossed her arms, and while she was walking, she closed her eyes and asked him to stop talking so much and get down to business. Lu Fan began to look around with a calm gaze. He had obtained some information that Black Rat had given him about the flying wooden dragon. The location of the divine level treasure map was at the top of the sacred tree. While he was deep in his thoughts, the ground started to tremble. Feeling this, he snapped out of his trance and began to look at the ground, unable to help but wonder what was happening. Giant Ying let her arms drop to her sides. She started losing balance and with a confused look asked Lu Fan who had caused this earthquake. Lu Fan went on alert, started looking at the ground, clenched his teeth tightly and soon realized that this was not an earthquake but rather a group of flying dragons. A bunch of dragons appeared. They were different from the others as they had only 2 legs, a long neck, large wings and sharp teeth. They opened their mouths and as they were approaching Lu Fan and Giant Ying, they began to roar. A system window about these dragons appeared. They were called putrid flying dragons. They were level 50. Killing them was going to grant 37,120 experience points and 2772 dragon coins. They had materials called dragon teeth. The dragons landed on the ground, started approaching them and prepared to attack. Lu Fan sat on the ground, clenched his fists tightly, began to look at the dragons with a serious gaze and asked her to prepare for an attack. Giant Ying also sat down. She extended her hand backward making a sword appear. She started to stare at the dragons and thought this was not good. One of the dragons tried to attack her, but she started to look up, extended her hand towards it and used the skill called Shaking Mountains, which allowed her to cause 240% physical damage and disperse 24% of the damage to nearby enemy targets. In the blink of an eye, her sword cut the dragon's body in half. The sword cut its body in half and it started to fall towards the ground. The other dragons looked up and seeing that their companion had been massacred, they began to roar. The dragons became enraged. They started flying towards Lu Fan and with a piercing look prepared to attack. Lu Fan stood up, and while he was watching how little by little the dragons were getting closer, he decided it was time to do something about it. He clenched his fists tightly, started staring intently at the dragons, and called Zioya. She manifested, and while her body was surrounded by intense flames, she began to stare intently at the dragons and prepared to attack. She used the ability called Lava Flame, which allowed her to launch flames forward, causing damage while healing herself. By using this ability, she opened her mouth and launched a powerful flame towards the dragons. One of the dragons appeared behind Giant, started to move its paw closer, and prepared to attack by surprise. But it didn't take long for her to feel its presence. Her expression changed drastically. She couldn't help but be terrified and thought that this was not good at all. The dragon tried to attack her using its sharp claw, but luckily she jumped and managed to dodge the attack at the last second. Then, she extended her hand to one side and made the red sword appear. While she was in the air, she turned around, started looking at the dragon, extended her hand towards it, and used the ability called Armor Breaker, which allowed her to ignore 32% of the target's defense when dealing damage. The sword shot towards the dragon until it hit its mouth fully, causing its body to crash into the ground. Several seconds later, she began to descend towards the ground, started looking forward, and upon seeing what was happening, she couldn't help but be surprised. The reality was that she had moved away from the cliff, and because of this, she began to fall towards the bottom. With her last strength, she extended her hand towards the top of the cliff, and with a look full of fear, gave the order to the Sword of Destruction to come. While she was falling towards the bottom of the cliff, another dragon appeared above her. It started advancing towards her, opened its mouth, and prepared to attack. Upon seeing this, she clenched her teeth tightly, and with a serious look realized that this was not good since she did not have time to dodge the attack. But luckily, Lu Fan was not going to let her be attacked. While she was falling towards the bottom of the cliff and the dragon was slowly approaching her, Lu Fan drew the dragon dagger, and using Zioya's flames began to approach her at great speed. He started to move the dagger. He began to stare at the dragon and used the skill called Dragon Tooth Strike. Just before the dragon could make a move, Lu Fan attacked it using the dagger, cutting its body in half. While he was holding the dagger, he remained silent. The Dragon Fang Strike skill enhanced by the Blood Pact allowed him to manipulate the dragon's energy to deliver a powerful blow with his current weapon. He began to approach Giant, extended his hand towards her, and with a calm look, asked her to grab his hand. Just before she could fall, he approached her and grabbed her arm. With a confused look, she began to wonder what was happening. Now that he had grabbed Giant, he began to turn his body backward, and with a look full of determination, placed his foot on the cliff wall, and then stabbed the dagger to stop falling. While the leaves were falling downwards, he managed to stop his moving body, preventing himself from falling to the bottom of the cliff and saving Giant in the process. He grabbed her arm even more tightly, started looking at her, and asked her to be careful. Upon hearing his voice, she began to look up and remain silent. With a pleasant smile, he explained to her that their destiny was not down below. She began to look Lu Fan in the eyes and, while blushing, started smiling and thanked him for saving her again. While he had the dagger stuck in the cliff wall, he exerted force and began to lift Giant. At that moment, a loud roar started to be heard. She began to look ahead and with a confused look asked Lu Fan if the flying dragons had returned. He responded to her that this was not a flying dragon. A giant dragon began to ascend and passed by them, but luckily Lu Fan reacted in time, grabbed Giant firmly and moved her aside, dodging the attack. Upon seeing the size of the dragon, she couldn't help but be in shock. Lu Fan was left speechless but still remained calm. With a shout, he called Zioya. Zioya, who was calm and sitting at the top of the cliff, heard Lu Fan's voice. She started to look towards them and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. Someone with fingers made of stones put their hand on the cliff and started to climb. This was a dragon. It climbed a little, approached Zioya, opened its mouth, and while its eyes were shining, it began to roar. Zioya got a little scared since this dragon was gigantic compared to her. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.